Welcome to Missing the Mark, where we look for meaning in strange places. I'm Christopher. Today I want to talk about the grave danger that is posed by a person trying to find their meaning in another human being or human beings. Now, the reason why this is such a problem, because I want to sort of get out of the way a question, which will come up for a lot of people, of like, well, why do you need a meaning at all? Why can't you just do stuff? And the reason why, and this is sort of a question of anthropology, not in the academic sense, but the sort of original sense, the study of human beings, or the logos of human beings. So human beings have two purposes. God has given us two purposes. One is to love God, that is to say, to appreciate God's goodness. And the second is to take part with God in creation through what is technically called secondary causation, what I like to call delegation. Just a real simple example of this is if you teach somebody something, you are God's gift of that knowledge to that person. If somebody is hungry and you feed them, you are God's gift of food to that person. You are taking part in bringing creation about through secondary causation. God is the one who brings forth everything out of nothing and has given it to you to do this thing. And you are, as a secondary thing, deriving your primary being from God, performing this action that God has given to you, and in so doing becoming part of God's act of creation. In fact, this kind of governs all interactions of human beings, because the direct link, the direct appreciation of God is between you and God directly, and other people aren't really involved. And so contemplating the goodness of God, appreciating the goodness of God, enjoying the goodness of God, however exactly you want to phrase it, these are all sort of direct between you and God, and a creature that had no sense perception of any kind, no ability to act on any sort of shared, in any sort of shared reality, would still be able to do this. We share a reality through which we're able to influence each other, and its purpose is God's gift of secondary causation to us, that we can take part in being part of creation and being part of the creation of each other. And so we intuit on some level that all of our actions in the world are supposed to be directed towards some end, towards some natural end in the sense of the Greek word telos, meaning or purpose. And the reason why is because we are composite beings, and everything in this world is a composite being. Everything physical, at the very least, is a composite being. I don't want to get into angelology. Not a field I've studied in detail. But at least everything physically in the world, and all things which are soul united to matter, are composite beings in which lesser being, through rational relationship, becomes a greater being. You can see this very simply in something like the act of painting. You take a bunch of colored dirt. Then you mix that colored dirt with oil. And then you take this oil with the colored dirt in it, and you take a canvas, you take a bunch of cotton fluff, and then the plants already arrange the base atoms and stuff into things that are far more significant anyway. And you spin this, and then you weave this, and you've got a canvas, and then you take this colored dirt in oil, and you take a bunch of hairs bound up onto a stick, and you dip the one in the other, and you move them in just the right way, and you create a painting. And this painting has beauty. This painting conveys truth about the world and about the goodness of the world. It's a good painting. And in so doing, you have created something whereby this rational relationship of all of the little specks of pigment, because pigments are essentially just dirt, when you get down to it, just different colors of dirt, and then you just happen to have a way of separating them out. You have created, through a rational relationship, they have more being, they have greater being than they have simply on their own or as a strict sort of sum of each thing. You have synergy in that original sense, where the sum is greater than the parts. That is how creation works for us. This is how, within composite being, lesser becomes greater by being in a rational relationship that creates another level of being on top of it. This is why painting a painting and knocking the pigments over onto the floor are not equivalent actions to each other, because the one puts them into a rational relationship and the other into an irrational relationship where there is no greater being. And that is the thing towards which our actions are supposed to be directed, because we are taking part with God as God's free gift to us in the act of creation, secondarily. We are imposing onto things that have being and therefore are good still greater being by putting them into a rational relationship with each other. This means that our actions are supposed to be directed towards an end, because that end is that greater being towards which we are putting things into rational relationship. We know this on some level. Now, I mean, the number of people who would be able to describe it like that is not very high, but the number of people who intuitively know it is, well, everybody. That's where we all know we need some sort of meaning, and why you can't just do random actions, because we know on some level that our purpose is to impose a rational ordering to lesser beings such that it comes together into that greater being of being a synergistic whole, as subatomic particles form atoms, and atoms form molecules, and molecules form cells, and cells form animals. To give one example of where you get levels of composite being forming something greater as they go along. We know this, and that's why we need meaning. That's why we need meaning, because if you don't have that meaning, if you don't have that rational end towards which you are working, that idea of goodness, which is given to us by God, and we have to receive that from God, that rational being. We don't create this meaning from nothing. We are given this meaning, and then we are given the ability to realize this meaning. The creation of the meaning is actually the creation ex nihilo, the calling forth of being from nothing. Calling forth is a sort of poetic way of putting it. It's very technically inaccurate. But the giving of being to things which would not otherwise have being, that's the more fundamental part. God is doing that. We just do the kind of simple thing of like recognizing it and bringing that about through matter so it can take part in that act of creation. Now, if a human being does not look to God for this meaning, but a human being looks instead to another human being, this gets really dangerous, first for the person because they're destroying themselves, and frequently for that other person. So I want to go through a few examples of where people do this, because it's the same mistake in all of these cases, but depending on who they're doing it to, you see a very different expression of it. So probably the most classic is the example of the lover, where one person makes another person their entire world, puts them on a pedestal, as the saying goes. What's on pedestal? Your statues of your gods in the ancient world. Statues of saints in the more modern one, but it sort of comes from that of, who would you put on a pedestal? Yeah, well, that's who. The idea basically from the putting them on a pedestal is you then worship them. Well, what are you doing? You're treating them as your God. You are deriving your meaning from them. And what does that mean in a practical sense? You are looking to their whims, to their wishes, their desires for what you should be doing in all things, and concomitantly with that, you are looking for their approbation. You want them to be happy, because of course intrinsically, if you are putting things into a right ordering, if you are doing what you are supposed to be doing, that should make the other person happy. If that other person is God, they should be happy with you. Not to say that with the actual God, that you make God happy in the sense of adding to God's being something that was not already present. You metaphorically make God happy in that you are fulfilling the purpose of your own creation. You're being what you should be, and in so doing, you are able to receive that goodness from God that fills you up and makes you happy. It's just sort of easier to say you make God happy. You're pleasing God. Anyway, then, if you look in that case where the person has done this to the other person, they are looking for that happiness. It will not always be there, necessarily. There's no way in a fallen world that you will ever... I mean, this can only exist in a fallen world anyway. There is no way you're ever going to completely please another human being, because that's not a thing a human being can do. They will intrinsically be it will necessarily be displeased. You are then going to be tremendously unhappy, because obviously you're failing in the purpose of your being, since they should be happy if you're actually fulfilling your meaning, the meaning of your life. And this is going to make you phenomenally unhappy, and what's going to happen at some point is you're going to kind of, on some level, realize that they're a creature, and then get really, really angry at them for not being God as you want them to be, for not smiling on you when you're doing what you, in your mind, should be doing. And this is where love so easily turns to hate. Not actual love, But this is where need very easily turns to hate. Need so incredibly easily turns to hate. At least illegitimate need. And so that is the sort of destructive thing. And if you look, you can see it. When this happens, these sort of relationships invariably become abusive. People become angry. They come to resent and hate. They attempt to force the other person into reacting in the way that they should, so that when the other person is not properly conforming them, is not giving them the sort of rewards that should be happening, when things are not going right, they get angry and lash out and just want things to be right. There you go. This is an expression of looking for God in another human being. Another example, another common one, all too common one, parents with their children. And this is, it's often frequently horrific. It can be done to varying degrees, of course. And so, people partake of errors in varying degrees from moment to moment because we're not consistent. It's never particularly safe, and it takes somewhat different expressions, though. So for an infant, their parent really is their whole world. For the first 6 months of their life, it's pretty much true that their parents are their whole life. Their whole world, because really they don't do very much other than, if possible, go to sleep while you're holding them and feed and be held and look at you. This is as far as possible an infant's entire life. And, it changes over time. And so it is possible within this. Sometimes you still, and this is where you can get things like shaken baby syndrome, where you will see parents occasionally turning very angry against a child who simply will not turn happy. Where they don't know, like, I've changed you, I've fed you, I've given you everything, what can I possibly give you? And still you're screaming, what's wrong? Will you just stop screaming? That sort of thing. And I think, every parent will feel, because that's going to happen to everyone, and every parent will feel some measure of, like, something is terribly wrong, what's wrong? But it is possible for that to turn into anger because the meaning of their life is going wrong. As a parent, you have strong instincts, like, I want to take care of this child, what can I possibly do, what's wrong here? And it can be frustrating and frightening and so on. You can feel a lot of very strong emotions, but those aren't anger. They're not really even adjacent to anger. It's when the meaning of your life is making them happy that suddenly now anger becomes really, really possible in that sort of situation, because this is really showing you to be wrong. It's not really the only case where a parent can get angry at an infant. But it's one of the sort of big ways. So you can see it there. As they get older, you can see this in the smothering sort of thing, where you see with smothering parents who can't stand their child's world broadening out, because the older the child gets, the less of your world they become. You still have lots to teach them, but their interests extend far past you into many other things. And in fact, many of the things you'll have to teach them as they get older are about those other things. And so the smothering parent is the one who doesn't want their child to start investigating the world, start looking at the world. Still worse, do they want their child to be things like romantically successful, or to find their vocation, if their vocation is, say, a priest or a religious brother or sister, because now they are taking on a primary responsibility that will take them so tremendously away from their parent. Now, I do want to be clear, by the way, that the fact that it is a parent's job to raise their child to be a human being, to give to them, it's an imitation of God, that you call them forth out of nothing, so that you may continue to give more to them. It is an imitation of God in that sense. And so, it is your job to raise them up to be an independent human being who no longer needs you and is capable of functioning so much so as an independent human being that they can themselves call forth another human being to imitate God in that manner. That's not to deny the incredible value of extended families, which is enormous, and it's also not to deny that children have a responsibility to their parents, in old age, for example, because it's a fallen world and people degenerate, and nor is it to deny that parents and children can become friends as the child becomes an adult. In fact, and again, this is literally an imitation of God. God raises us up so that we can become friends with God. in like manner, a parent raises the child up so the parent can become friends with the child. It's a long progress, and of course the one comes before the other. You have to raise them before you can be their friend. You can go horribly wrong trying to be their friend before you raise them. It can be catastrophic in many ways. It can be incredibly damaging to the child. But the goal is to create that distance. You give them such that they are capable of being enough on their own they can be friends. And it's a gradual process, and varies very greatly. If you are playing a game of chess with your 10-year-old child and you are following the rules of chess, you are being a friend to your child in that very particular regard, because the two of you are standing as equals, appreciating something outside of each other. You are together loving the game of chess as equals, because that's the only way you can play chess with another person in that way. Now, if you're cheating the game for the sake of the child, you might just be a parent, not a friend in that way. But once you're actually able to say, like, just play a game, or checkers or what have you, if you can play a game of checkers, you're playing it as a friend if you're playing according to the rules. It's a very narrow, it's in that particular way you can relate to each other as friends, but still, in most ways, you relate as a parent, not as a friend. You don't eat dinner together as friends. You have the child actually eat nutritious food and so on. As a parent, you are guiding them and training them and so on. But for, minor things, you can. So I'm not denying any of that. Parents and children eventually become friends if the thing is done well. But that in itself is actually not at all what the person who has made the child the purpose of their life wants. In fact, that is rather antithetical to it. They do not want a friend, because a friend is independent of a person. You will occasionally see, I should note, people who will try to make a friend, very, very lonely people will try to make a friend God to them and try to find the meaning of their life in their friend. But there's such a strong tendency to just flame out spectacularly, because the relationship just really is not close to that, and doesn't really bear up to anything like that. And it gets so far, anything trying like that will get so far in the way of the person's primary responsibilities. It doesn't tend to last long and be very painful for the people involved, but you don't tend to see that too much. Now, moving on, you can find this in groups of people. You can find this in a club, where the club becomes the meaning of the person's life, and they become the terror of the club. Social clubs, where they want everyone to be as devoted to it as they are, because this is the meaning of their life. And if it's the meaning of their life, it really needs to be the meaning of everyone else's life too. And it needs to be held in this sort of way, and everyone needs to sort of give them the feedback that everything is going right. And so they will necessarily become the terror of the club. You can see a similar sort of thing in workplaces. I believe in workplaces it will tend to be a little bit quieter, because of the natural hierarchies of the workplace, but people can terrorize their workplace for a similar sort of reason, where the workplace becomes their life and their reason for existing. You can see this, next stage up, you can see this in things like nationalism and racism, for example, are both tribalism, nationalism, racism. Those things all, whether it's my tribe, if you're in a society that's organized by tribes, or my race, or my nation. You don't see the nation one too much anymore, because we saw how spectacularly that one flamed out. The big problem that all of these have, if you're going to treat these things, there's sort of two things. One, you need that sort of fierce loyalty to in everybody else to the thing, and so you will go on, the modern meaning of the word witch hunts to find people who are insufficiently loyal. And you can see in things like the French Revolution, the guillotine gets very busy, or in the Soviet Union, where again, the executions just never stop, because you keep on rooting out the people who don't truly love the party or the nation or what have you as much as they should, or the revolution, the ideal, whatever exactly it is. You don't see that one as much, because it's flamed out so spectacularly and people haven't completely forgotten that one yet. You can see in racism the same sort of thing, my race, but it develops that same sort of love-hate relationship, where people are inside are insufficiently pure. And like with nationalism, racism, etc., there's also the problem of, what about the people outside of it? Because when God is the meaning of your life, all people are God's creatures. and so they relate to God and they relate to the meaning of your existence. But when your tribe or your nation or your race is God, well, all those people who aren't in it, they're nothing. They're just sort of they're in competition. They're a problem, but they have no. There's no way they can relate rightly to the thing. They can only relate wrongly, and that's basically by existing. And well, again, the 20th century showed a bunch of what happens when you go down that road. It's also incidentally why people hate things like immigration or mixed marriages. Immigration and mixed marriages, or miscegenation, if you want to use the older term, which can be useful because it kind of shows you what's really going on psychologically speaking. What's going on is you are mixing these groups. Immigration mixes the group. If you have a black person and a Chinese person have a baby, is this Chinese? Is it black? It's not really either. It's not really neither. And you can see the racist's head explode because like his whole meaning is for this one group, and so it has to be pure in order for it to be able to give him this meaning. And these things are outside of it have to stay outside of it because they are not from where he gets his meaning. And so if that miscegenation is actually the creeping in of meaningless into the thing from which he gets his meaning. And this is why you will see such incredibly visceral hatred of that sort of thing. Now, you can also see this in subgroups. You can see this, if a person wants to help the poor, the downtrodden, or the oppressed. This one is fairly popular these days. And you can kind of see the effects of it in various ways. It tends to come concomitantly with an infantilization, interestingly. And I think the reason you see this infantilization is precisely because the oppressed, the downtrodden, the poor, whomever it is precisely, needs to be a victim in order for the person who is helping them to have meaning in their life. The purpose of my life is to raise up these other people. If you merely want to help fellow creatures, you can help them, at which point they've been helped, now you can go do something else. If the meaning of your life is to help these people, not the meaning of your life at this moment, like your life is to do the will of God, and the will of God in this moment is to do this thing, but rather the meaning of your life is to help these people, well then, you need them to stay in need of help. You can never actually help them. And so they're complicated things and aspects of like, the other thing is like if you try to help them, very often help doesn't work. I mean, in practice, help just often frequently doesn't work. People don't need you or can't accept your help or whatever. And that if this was the meaning of your life, this is going to hurt like hell, literally. Like hell. And so this, by the way, will show why cowards will far prefer to make all of their help something indirect and generalized so that they can't actually see it failing in any way. And so this way they sort of can't have that pain of hell visited upon them of trying to help and failing, even though this is the purpose of their life. So that's sort of another thing that goes into it. And so if you look among these aren't the exclusive ones, but I think it's a sufficient list to sort of show the extreme variety from parents and lovers and, nationalists. And when I say nationalists, I mean, my nation, right or wrong, the sort of nationalism you saw in the early 1900s, for example, late 1800s, early 1900s, that sort of thing. You can see this in regionalism, you can see this in tribalism, you can also see this in, modern wokeism and so on, where people define themselves in terms of helping other people. All of these things, they are all the same fundamental mistake. They all, if you look, will have certain characteristics because people always react to these things as any sort of challenge to this purpose in their life, as an existential threat, because this is depriving them of the meaning of their life, of why they should be getting out of bed in the morning if there's anything about this that is questioned. And so they all tend to react in the same way. The expression looks quite different because of who the victims of this are and the particular circumstances, and even within victims it'll change and so on. But if you look around, you'll see there are a lot of commonalities about how they need to preserve this meaning and other things like it. So, that's that's the problem and sort of ways of recognizing and manifestations of people who are looking for the meaning of their life in some other human being. Until next time, may you hit everything you aim at.